Perfect. Wanted to give welcome today, everybody, to our first session of conspiracy theory as method, speculation, and infrastructure of belief, with your instructor, Joseph C. Russo. This workshop invites participants to treat conspiracy theory not simply as pathology or misinformation, but as a mode of world making, a method of connecting fragments, sensing hidden structures, and producing meaning amidst chaos. Drawing on anthropological, philosophical, and artistic perspectives, we will approach conspiracy theory as both a cultural phenomenon and an epistemic practice that attempts to render the invisible visible. Across 4 sessions, participants will examine key theoretical and ethnographic approaches to conspiracy theory, from Cold War anthropology and psychoanalytic accounts of projection to contemporary digital subcultures and the aesthetics of evidence. Each week, we will pair a short reading or media artifact with a practical task, tracing a historical or contemporary conspiracy narrative, mapping its effective economies, or producing a short speculation, text, image, sound that reflects how conspiracies form. And Joey Russo is a cultural anthropologist whose work explores conspiracy, security, and the effective life of suspicion. He is the author of Hard Luck and Heavy Rain, The Ecology of Stories in Southeast Texas, which received the Ruth Benedict Prize honorable mention and the Eddie Turner Prize for first book in ethnographic writing. His recent research examines the anthropology of conspiracy theory and the phenomenology of belief in late modernity. He has been a visiting professor at Wesleyan University and SUNY Purchase, as well as an adjunct lecturer at numerous universities. He is currently an independent ethnographer and scholar, performing fieldwork throughout the rural American South. And from there, so Joey, I was gonna say, I was checking out to do the breakout rooms, how you were talking about formatting part of the class later on, and the webinar structure of the Zooms doesn't let us do the breakout room. So, is there any other way you were thinking about doing the group dynamic after the lecture?
I imagine maybe there's a way to organize people into little research buckets outside of the class. Maybe we could do something there's so many platforms they've sent me. I feel kind of overwhelmed. There's Discord, which maybe is good for that. I've never really used it. Um, yeah, so maybe Luis, we can speak after about what the best way to do that is, and we can let people think about what bucket they'd like to be in. Um, for next time. Oh, you're muted.
That sounds perfect then. I guess we can look at it when we get to that part. And then from there, I can
Yeah.
pass it on to you, Joey.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Luis. Well, hi everybody. Um, I'm Joey. This is the first workshop or any kind of class I'm teaching for the new center. I'm really excited to be invited to teach this conspiracy theories method workshop. In the past, I've taught this course as a semester-long course, usually called something like Anthropology of Conspiracy or Conspiracy Theory. So I've attempted to kind of change the form, modify the form a bit, not only because we only have 4 sessions together, but because we have what looks like 60 people registered for this workshop. So I've sort of pivoted to attempt to kind of accommodate that structure. I guess we won't really be able to always hear from everyone um, in each session, but of course, we will hopefully hear from everyone at least a few times. This is definitely a discussion-based workshop. Um, I will do some lecturing, and starting next session, there'll be some PowerPoints that we can look at together that I'll upload to our, I guess, what is it, Google Classroom. Um, but I welcome discussion and I encourage discussion from you. And I always learn about new conspiracy theories and ways of approaching them whenever I teach this course. And I'm excited to learn from you as well. Um, I've modified the syllabus a bit. So Luis read the description, and I think The workshop is not exactly going to follow that format. I'm sure you've seen we will have more than one short reading per class. And I think rather than having weekly submissions, I'm going to ask that you simply submit two things to me over the course of the workshop. One will be next week when I ask for basically a project proposal. I'm asking everyone to choose a conspiracy theory and a way of approaching it. We'll talk more about that today. And I'm asking for you to next week submit a research proposal and bibliography to me, explaining how you intend to uh, explore your topic. I know we have a limited amount of time. So, and as always, I should say I'm open to the many methods and approaches that I'm sure we'll get in here. I know we have a lot of visual artists and uh, people from different disciplinary backgrounds. So I'm excited for the kind of the variety of approaches that we'll undoubtedly have. And then, of course, there's a final submission, which is a longer piece um, that can be multimodal. It can take different forms. I'm very open to that as well. Um, and then other than that, it will really be about how the discussion goes in here. You know, I'm hoping for a generative discussion of our readings, and I always encourage you to share what you're working on with us in general and how you're applying it to the readings. So that's the basic form of the course. Are there any questions or anything before we jump into it? Yes, there's a question in the chat. All of the submissions will get feedback from me, your proposals, and of course your finals. And I should say that for the proposals next week, don't feel like the intense pressure that it has to be locked in. I know projects change and ideas change. I'm kind of just more interested in how you are thinking about your project. And if the final version doesn't exactly align with the proposal, that doesn't bother me at all. In fact, it maybe speaks to your thinking as a process. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so um, before we get into the readings or the specifics for this session, um, I thought it might be useful to kind of speak a little bit about anthropology in general. Is this anyone's like first anthropology course? I don't know if you can raise your virtual hands or your real ones. Oh my gosh. Nearly Nearly everyone? Well, quite a few, quite a few of you. Cool. Well, welcome. Um, I'm glad you're here. So I won't make this too long, but yeah, I guess it is important maybe to give some background and context. And I'm sure you are familiar with the basics. Obviously, anthropology being the study of people, um, is a discipline that's separated into four different subfields. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And we will talk a lot about this word culture and, you know, the notoriety of having to kind of define it, which is something that anthropology has agonized over for, at least a century now. And I don't know that we've really gotten anywhere. Um, it's a discipline with an extremely complicated and recent history. And I think that's an important thing to mention for an anthropology of conspiracy theory course, because anthropology as a discipline has been wrapped up in um, covert operations as such, specifically in the United States, with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, since I don't know, a few decades after it became a kind of established academic discipline. And this is all public record now, but was speculated about for many years. And it's something that I'll bring up a lot. I think of it in the way David Price, an author and an anthropologist who I really like, he wrote a book called Cold War Anthropology, where he speaks about the dual uses of anthropology, which I think is sort of the most generous way to talk about the history of the discipline, right? On the one hand, you have a discipline which introduced, I think, a fair amount, if not the bulk of what today we would probably call liberal discourse. And I don't mean neoliberal discourse. I mean, at least in this country, um, the kind of politics around liberalism, identity, what we call today identity politics, concepts of race, uh, ethnicity, gender, sex, religion, belief, and so forth. Um, and in many ways, in its early days, kind of trailblazed a lot of really important conversations during the earlier part of the 20th century around those topics. Um, and yet, again, at the same time, dual use. Anthropology is also always in the service of the state's various intelligence operations. And we can talk about the specifics of these operations, but many of our kind of celebrated canonical figures within anthropology were CIA operatives during the Cold War and afterward. And were kind of producing work that both served their own academic careers, as well as literally were submissions to the Department of War, the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and so forth on different cultures around the world. With regard to their natural resources, their capacities for defense, their concepts of war, violence, and so forth. So it's a complex history and discipline, and it's not one that, I always say it has quite a bit of blood on its hands, and yet here we are. Um, Specifically, anthropology is uh, cultural anthropology anyway, which is what we'll be focusing on here. It's a discipline which relies on qualitative research methods, right? Obviously, I'm sure you're all familiar with the differences between quantitative and qualitative, but qualitative means that we are employing an experiential research practice, right? The anthropologist traditionally travels to and lives with, often for a very long time, the group that they're studying. And traditionally, this meant they would go to these far-flung places, such as Papua New Guinea, for instance, a place that anthropologists can't seem to leave alone, and do things like, learn the language and learn all about what was happening there, et cetera, et cetera. And became specialists in, they call them area specialists in their respective regions. Um, the idea, I think, behind this form of qualitative research, which we call ethnographic research, is to immerse the researcher as much as possible into, so to speak, a different life world or cultural way. The early anthropologists called it, specifically Bronislaw Malinowski called it understanding the native's point of view back in the 20s. And it attempts to sort of reverse or um, uh, I guess you could say there's been a very long conversation between anthropology and, let's say, Enlightenment philosophy from the very beginning, right? Where the anthropologist understands the Enlightenment philosophers as deductive thinkers, beginning with something like an axiom, all human beings do this or that, positing things like human nature, but, without ever leaving the comfort of their libraries. And when anthropology comes along quite a bit later, it says, how is it possible or how is it feasible for human beings to posit these kind of fundamental qualities about other human beings if they've never met them, if they have never experienced them? Sounds like common sense to us today, but it was something of a radical proposition at the time. This idea, which anthropology um, especially through Columbia University here in New York under the guidance of Franz Boas, who people often refer to as the father of anthropology, that difference as such, cultural difference, is something that can be encountered not only as benevolent rather than threatening, but that in fact being with and learning about other cultures might even, in fact, teach us things about them that are valuable and therefore teach us things about ourselves. Um, and of course, this kind of opposition to the perception of deductive thinking on the part of the Enlightenment philosophers was referred to, especially in the early days of anthropology, as inductive thinking. This notion that the anthropologist is not certain about anything about the groups that they're studying until they have directly observed them. And they begin with this kind of blank slate, right, and add ideas about the group as they experience it. Of course, we can get into the impossibility of the human being, right, as an objective observer, right? We're not cameras, and maybe cameras aren't even objective observers, I suppose. But it was a kind of a sort of game, I think, that the anthropologist played and continues to play, where we act as though we can enter a space without any judgment or without any kind of presuppositions about cultures and so forth. Um, and some of the important moments, some of the important contributions of early anthropology include this, I think, deeply now maligned idea of cultural relativism. I see, I spend a lot of time with far right people in my research and just got back, um, well, not just got back, but last summer, staying with a citizens militia for a time. And cultural relativism is really something that they evoke as, this kind of like horrible, propagandistic, indoctrinating discourse that the universities are poisoning the minds of the children with. And although I think this is based on a very kind of fundamental misunderstanding of cultural relativism, I have to say, now that I consider myself a recovering academic, I can't really say that I disagree completely. And we can talk about why. But, the basic concept around cultural relativism, something that was really first articulated at length by Ruth Benedict in her book Patterns of Culture. She's a student of Boaz at Barnard at Columbia. He allowed female students into his classroom, which was a kind of radical thing at the time, and ended up having an entire generation of women anthropologists who became sort of the first academic anthropology celebrities, right? Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, the list goes on. Um, but in Patterns of Culture, Ruth Benedict suggests that um, in this pursuit of the idea of difference as benevolent and helpful, that for each culture, value is determined relatively, right? Meaning that value is something that is based on what she called cultural experience, and that for each culture, these rules, these sets of standards and notions of ethics and ritual and so forth are specific. And even though anthropologists eventually decide that all cultures share these certain kind of basic traits, the difference, the specificity of them is kind of what's at stake for this generation of ethnographers, right? It isn't right that there are some cultures who look at things backwards or wrong, but that there are always reasons for these beliefs and practices, and they can only really be understood through this kind of immersive ethnographic method. Um, and uh, Benedict, in her patterns of culture, um, brings up a lot of really interesting examples around cultural difference that we will likely speak about later. Um, I won't go into all of the contributions. I'm not here to sell you on anthropology completely, but the other really big important one that I think a lot of people don't know about is around the concept of race, right? Early 20th century, we have what is, today referred to often as biological racism or scientific racism. The kind of scientific consensus at the time is that race was a strictly biological marker, a static biological marker, right? Like people of different races, more or less, were understood as almost like, different species of animal. And of course, this was all along a hierarchy. And that depending on one's race, there were certain capacities, including emotional, psychological, intellectual capacities, where there was simply a limit. And anthropology really disproves this. Um, Boaz, in fact, leads a group of researchers um, at the behest of the federal government during the kind of anxieties of human migration, Ellis Island and everything during the early 20th century, where the government was worried about the idea of racial mixing and immigrants replacing us and so forth. Sounds familiar. And there was this really famous book written in the early 20th century by this guy, Madison Grant, called The Passing of the Great Race. It was this immensely popular book. He was kind of industrialist. And he suggested that, I mean, and you'll have to forgive me if I laugh, but just imagining the audacity of this metaphor. He says, like the buffalo of the Great Plains, who had been eradicated in the space of like a decade by settlers, so too passes the Great Race. And of course, he means specifically Anglo-European settlers. Um, and so the sort of fervor around this fear was something that seeps into the anxieties of the state, of course, and something a study called the Dillingham Commission is put into effect by the federal government at this time. And Franz Boas and his team of researchers are engaged to try to determine exactly what was going on with this incredible place, New York City, which was a kind of unprecedented mixing of different cultures, ethnicities, and races at the time, where for the first time, maybe ever, people from far-flung corners of the globe are living on the same city blocks and what the effects of that were. And so Boaz goes out into the field with his researchers and right. I mean, at the time, the tools of the racial sciences were things today that we consider pseudoscientific practices, right? Phrenology, the sort of measuring of bumps on the head to talk about, if you were angry or something or crazy. Anthropometry, right? Using these calipers to measure the average length between the knee and the ankle and so forth, which was believed to strictly be different amongst different races. Physiognomy, which again, the study of the face and its various features. In France, a fellow by the name of Alphonse Bertillon creates today what we call the mugshot, right? And it's based on the idea that a visual archive of the criminal type can be established through the photographing and documenting of the criminal. And therefore, we could create a consistent visual archive about who the criminal types are. And as you might imagine, they already had their ideas about who they were. But physiognomy was this kind of pseudoscience based on certain things about the face can tell us things about a person's even moral capacities. So Boaz, already having a suspicion that anthropometry was bunk, goes out into New York City with his group, and they are studying first generation immigrant children and adolescents, and have this incredibly rich, varied sample. And they're performing these anthropometric pieces of research and also adding in these kind of interviews where they discover miraculously that, in fact, these kids of this generation raised in New York City have more in common, to oversimplify it, they have more in common with one another than they do with their parents in many cases. And this wasn't simply a matter of, obviously it's culture, right? They've been educated and socialized in the same place and have similar language use, but it also had to do with nutrition. There's sort of people coming from these subsistence economies and so forth. Had eventually it was measured. It was like millimeter difference, but different average height and so forth. But in so doing, and in submitting these findings to the federal government, who, by the way, totally buried them because it wasn't a desired outcome. Anthropology begins the really long process that I don't know that we've ever really won this battle that race is cultural, not biological in the way that it was understood then. And the irony here, of course, is that Ruth Benedict is writing Patterns of Culture, but she also then writes The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, this ethnography about Japan, without ever having gone there during the Cold War as a kind of piece of uh, contracted propaganda to explain to the American public. And also an immensely popular book, one of the first kind of coffee table anthropology books, and beautifully written, I have to say. Um, that the Japanese had to be stopped at all costs. She defines them as an honor shame society, and more or less has the thesis that, well, it's a matter of honor for them. So if we hadn't dropped the bomb, uh, the thing would never have stopped, and so forth. Margaret Mead writes her own version. So it's this kind of incredible Jekyll and Hyde situation with this discipline, going back to its origins. And therefore, also, I believe, having a kind of direct hand in the body of work that we'll be looking at in this workshop, meaning specifically conspiracy theory. Um, and I mean that literally, right? Like they're doing this kind of statecraft, aiding statecraft, creating new forms of surveillance. Gregory Bateson, the father of cybernetics, often seen as this kind of nice, sweet hippie. He's brought over by the American government during the Cold War and put into Japanese radio space to create kind of signal jamming methods, to broadcast kind of demoralizing fake news stories about the emperor and other things, in order to demoralize our perceived enemies. So that's the short version. I can go on, but this is why I think anthropology is both an extremely valuable, it has extremely valuable methods for looking at what today we call conspiracy theory, and at the same time, it has a direct hand in creating them. And something I like to say to students is, and I believe this is maybe a bit of an oversimplification as well, but an anthropology of conspiracy theory says conspiracy theory, more or less, is a set of irrational specificities undergirded by rational drives. And when we say rational, we have the proviso that rationality shifts depending on what culture we're in, what time period we're in, but that it is never a wholesale creation based in some kind of pathological hallucination that comes from nothing. I think we would be hard pressed to find any conspiracy theory that, first of all, doesn't have some kernel of so-called truth in it, but also that doesn't come from a place of what I think of as a rational drive. And the rational drive, in most cases, I think, is for the world to make sense, right? For the world to be narrativizable, right? Like, okay, we have this really complicated story about geopolitics and this and that and all of these horrific histories, but in fact, it's all about, there are these lizards, right? And they're in charge and they live underground and they're real and we can go find them and get them, if we want to, right? And it's this kind of really poetic, I think, narrative, world building practice, which says, I know the answer. I know that the world makes sense. And then the second part of that for many conspiracy theorists I've met in the field is, and I can tell you why and how and what you've got to do because you don't know, right? It creates this kind of insider outsider, I'm the expert here. And it kind of models itself after the way like the Western culture industry creates the figure of the expert, right? The talking head, it kind of just like models itself on that. And I think sometimes that's all people have to see, just like somebody sitting there going, well, stuff and facts. I'm a doctor, and that's enough. It's wild, but it's extremely seductive and very successful. So, any comments? Any questions? We can now bring in the readings if you'd like. I'm happy to talk about them. I know they're kind of a mixed bag. I begin with Hofstadter because he's sort of a great foil here. He's one of the first academic heads to really address after the assassination of John F. Kennedy this thing, conspiratorial thinking, as he calls it, a political style. But I think he also gets a lot of things wrong in kind of funny ways, and he's fun to kind of talk back to. And then obviously I have Latour's essay that I'm sure many of you have read, but these other really great pieces by Susan Lepsalter, short piece, and Katie Stewart, one of my favorite pieces of writing on conspiracy theory that's almost taking on, I think, uh, the discursive style of the conspiracy theorist, right? In its form. So yeah, who will be our brave first commenter, questioner? Yeah, Alex.
Hi. Yeah, I just sort of like was going over the readings this week, and I actually really like the paranoia, the sort of paranoid style, and so I sort of like as a research, like my research practice is based in sort of Jean Baudrillard, so you can imagine how a lot of the readings really like appeal to me. Um, so like I really like that immediately we're dealing with like the conspiratorial term in terms of like an aesthetic. Um, and like there's that moment in the paranoid style of in American politics where it says, there's some truth to it, right? It's not without like a lot of responsible leaders have accepted conspiracy theories or like with the masonry stuff. And yeah, I said like not all of these charges and fears need to be dismissed as entirely without foundation. And so um, the problem with the paranoid style seems to be less about the like criticism it's making and more with the like sometimes I feel this even in like the contemporary is that it's like the lack of like a bourgeois refinement around the aesthetic or the criticism that is being made. And so it kind of, I thought about it in terms of in the anti-masonry essay, it was like the puritanical Christianity and the temperance communities were forwarding those criticisms, so naturally they were going to sound different to like what an academic might expect from a criticism. And I thought of like a contemporary parallel was in the way like I don't know if anyone ever seen the way a Christian sort of deconstruction of Monster Energy sounds very different to the way like a nutritionist would deconstruct Monster Energy. And so it's like it boils down to this kind of the hegemonic sites of kind of liberalism get to determine legitimate criticism from like the the conspiratorial turn. Um, yeah, so I wonder if we're still in that kind of position where like who gets to decide between what is critical theory and what is a conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great, thank you. I think it's a great observation. And it's something that certainly I think is symptomatic of Hofstadter and his U Chicago friends, especially at this time. It's a matter of like who controls, right, critical discourse. And I think something that really frightened people at the time and absolutely still today, although I think QAnon has sort of settled back into its various little pods, but I was in Dallas for the height of it, and lived with this sort of evangelical, I won't call them a cult, but they met at Dealey Plaza every morning, where right at the site where JFK was killed, and prayed and laid hands and even tried to bring in a snake handler, and believed that JFK Jr. was alive, and actually ended up identifying a gentleman in Philadelphia by the name of Vincent Fusca, who they brought down. I got to meet him, brought him down to Dallas. Um, and they were freaky. They were freaky people. They were kind of a sort of 21st century reincarnation of like what people used to call Jesus freaks. They were kind of hippies, they had all these things. But they eventually were disbanded, from the downtown when they became something of a nuisance. And I think one of the things that you bring up is really important to our discussion, and we're going to read some of these ethnographic pieces that really deal with this, Briggs, next week. The idea that like conspiracy theory can be a recourse to um, owning discourse for those that have been disenfranchised, for those that have no recourse to voice. And it often involves like a kind of restaging or like pantomiming of the authoritative voice. And that is frightening to power, right? Um, the other thing before we have someone else talk, is that I'm a big Baudrillard fan myself. And when we get into the excerpts from this anonymously published conspiracist manifesto in a few weeks, the author, I think, very rightly points to the convergence between the conspiracist discourse and our kind of canonical post-structuralist and before thinkers, right, who are on the same page when it comes to the question of power, right? I mean, there's no question for somebody like Foucault, for instance, that the nature of power is to conspire. There is no other way, right? Like power is not good or bad. He calls it at some point, the microphysics of the social or something like that. It's there, and it has the question of conspiracy baked into its formula, right? And Baudrillard certainly is on that page and goes much further, I think, in that regard. So we'll see these interesting collusions, I think, between the canon of like lefty, whatever, homo discourse, people that are, that we love, and conspiracy theory that's really interesting. And I think kind of is still kind of fraught too. Yeah, Patrick.
I really like the Hofstadter article. There was a lot of good things there. I also like the Latour article a lot. There's something good about all of them, but just for my comment, being brief, making sure that there's space for other people to talk. The things that stuck out to me as someone who studied theory and criticism in in the English department is that Hofstadter's approach is uh, uh, like art history. He describes it like art history, so that aesthetic piece of it. But he says that these conspiracies, uh, the case studies show they're archetypal splendor. So here's this recurring symbolic pattern, and he puts it as universal. Now, those are the kinds of things that in postmodernism aren't allowed. You know, there's universalism and recurring patterns, the kind of perennial philosophy. You know, that there's kinds of thinking that come back and go away, come back and go away. So I thought it was interesting how um, his his theoretical approach is using these uh, things like universalism, perennialism, archetypes that aren't really in favor in the academy now, but does give us a lot of insight into how a phenomenon like this happens. And I also like the turn that Latour makes in the last article, which is moving beyond the postmodernist demolition project and reframing critique, you know, something that's in need of care, caution, protection, and uh, gathering things together. And the phrase that really stuck out was, you know, the turn from west to eastward. You know, that there was a lot of elusive in that. I thought, oh, what does that mean? The turn eastward, the turn towards something more interior, something more contemplative, something you know. So a couple of things that just stuck out to me as kind of a brief way of getting in and sharing what intrigued me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it makes me think that anthropology sort of has this problem as well, the idea that like despite the fact that we immerse in a culture that we're studying, at the end of the day we have to be able to maintain distinctions between right? Self and group, self and other. And anthropology traditionally, certainly after the kind of postmodern moment where anthropologists start, they call it the reflexive turn, where anthropologists start like, apologizing themselves out of their books, out of the introductions of their books. I went and studied the rural Greek, mourning rituals, but I swear to God, I didn't talk to anybody. I stood with my back to the wall and I was respectful, and it's all about power and symbolic violence. This thing that I think is one of the most violently misused, ironically, terms from Bourdieu, I guess, or somebody like that. But that anthropologists and anthropology students kind of continue to beat themselves over the head with, thereby kind of not allowing them to feel comfortable in making any real assertions about what they've seen, right? And so one of the reasons I like something like Kathleen Stewart's approach is that it kind of presupposes uh, the ethnographer as like the infected subject, the one who like has to be and is and must explore the idea that like what they've experienced has changed them, and that they don't return to the academy with a kind of really tidy notebook, but they return in a much more profoundly transformed way if they allow themselves to kind of recognize that. Uh, yeah. Yes. Kraniv, am I saying that right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, yeah, it's fine. No, one sentence that really stuck out to me with from Stewart was this where she starts talking about how the internet was made for a conspiracy theory, and that's just something that I really enjoyed in this. I don't know, somehow this text space, and then that one thing leads to another. It's very additive, and you can just sort of like go down all sorts of rabbit holes, and just I just found it also interesting too, like the time when it was written, like 1999. There's still a lot of optimism, probably, for the internet and looking back, some 30 years later, close to, and I don't know if I would feel the same way about things. It just seems to have more of a sinister overtone. But and then earlier in that essay, she was writing about uh, how the conspiracy will repeat, the trauma will it repeats itself, and it's like trauma's repeating, and you have this sense of remembering something, and that kind of, yeah, spoke to me in some ways. I've done some work in South Africa, like as art historian, visual anthropologist, and I sometimes had difficulty with the kind of stories that I would hear, and beliefs that I would encounter. So that's kind of what drew me to this course today.
Cool. Well, welcome. Yeah, I mean, how predictive, right? In 99 to be able to kind of look forward to what no one could have necessarily seen coming. Um, yeah, oh yeah, Jacqueline, yes.
Sorry, you can keep talking. I don't know where you want to steer the conversation.
No, I talk
Am I
enough, please.
okay? No, I mean I have so many thoughts about these things. I thought they were it's a great group of readings because I would read one and then be like, oh, but this, and then that would come. So it was good. But and so each had a little thing. I guess there was 2 points that and if I'm looking at the readings as a whole, and the writing styles were amazing. Like Kathleen Stewart's writing style is fabulous. Like you said, she sort of embodies what she's talking about. And but I'm curious. There's 2 things, 2 big points, I guess. One was this idea, and the only person who really gets into it, and you're going to pardon my pronunciation on the what is it, Lepselter? I don't know how to pronounce her last name. She's the only, like, I was both had a knee-jerk reaction against her piece because of the way she began, which seemed to me to um, go very lean into a way that I think almost exoticizes her subjects. As somebody who's also worked a lot on the right, I feel like there's a lot of I don't know, a little too much description, I think, in her description of the lifestyle and the poverty. And this, it's weird. But on the other hand, she's the only person who really talks about these historical reasons why people really do have legitimate reasons to fall into these conspiracy things anyway. And I wonder, and some of the other ones are wonderful. So there's this idea, sorry, I'll be more clear. This idea, I think, to make an overarching theory of conspiracy, and instead I found little bits in each place. And the Lepselter had this sort of more historical into it. It had and the Hofstadter had more of it was almost consoling because you're looking back in time and realizing this is not something totally new. Um, and then the Stewart, had that element of things, which I think there is an element of this, which is that it's simply pleasing and pleasurable. And so my other question, I guess, for the group is, I cannot help but read these texts, as I'm sure everybody is, in the context of current political situations and conspiracy theories and all the things we're looking at. And I didn't think there was enough distinction, or maybe in these pieces, I'm sure there is tons of writing about it that I don't know, of the way conspiracy theories operate on a quote unquote leftist side of politics and a quote unquote right side of politics, because I do think they operate differently. And I do think, yeah, I have strong feelings about that, but where they lend themselves to, and this apocalyptic version of politics feels much more, at least in America, a right wing that lends itself towards something that's less democratic or open. So I don't know. Questions for the group? There's a lot. Apologize.
No, no, thank you. I think we'll have a lot to talk about. I'm going to write down items and we'll continue to have comments and we'll hopefully circle back to these things. But absolutely. I mean, just to briefly say, I think that the left has not had the same like recourse to traditional conspiracist narrative until quite recently, in fact, where it was almost unconsciously, not always consciously anyway, assigned to the right in this country anyway. And but I notice now, we get this stuff about, Trump's ear not being bloody the next day and stuff. So, you know, I think we're on that track now. And I noticed it at first during lockdown in 2020 when, my mom who's like super hippie lefty, was sending me stuff about Wayfair and Wayfair Gate and the children are in the cabinets and they have the cabinets have children's names and so forth. And I thought, what? This is like what the people in Texas say. So, but it's on your script. But yeah, I think there's a whole lot to say. And I love to talk about this thing about the exotic and exoticizing, because I don't know that I've ever quite understood it. But of course I take your point and I'd love to go back to that. But yeah, thank you so much. Sean, hello.
Hello. Um, yeah, actually, a lot of both what Pranav and Jacqueline brought up are things that I'm also thinking about. Um, and I'm coming to this workshop not as an academic, but as a conspiracy theorist, just kidding, as an artist who's thinking a lot about the internet and about what is showing up in algorithms and how like the pivots of influencer culture to kind of serve as like what Hofstadter calls the paranoid spokesperson. And so something that stuck out to me in the Hofstadter was like he's talking, this is like decades ago talking about how mass media has allowed for the villains of the right to become more vivid. So shifting from um, people thinking about like this work happening in the shadows and there's no real name or face to it to suddenly we have these political figures that we can then project all of these fears onto, and then thinking about the Stewart, which I also really appreciated from an artistic perspective, just like the what she's doing with language there and this idea of the internet being inherently conspiratorial just by the nature of it. And also thinking about like, yes, that was 1999 and now all you have to do is open Instagram and you see like ungodly things, no matter kind of what your political leanings are. Um, and I think, yeah, with like um thinking about like the exponential rise of mass media and like I think at the time that Hofstede is writing, it was the speed at which people were receiving information from mass media was a lot like now it's rapid fire. And there's no real way to kind of like what you were alluding to, Jody, like if people just see a nicely packaged article or website, or someone has a nice background and a suit on in the video that they're making, that's automatically deemed like something that is real. And obviously there was that kind of shit was happening with the press for decades that, obviously there were political leanings, but I wonder, and this is to Jacqueline's point as well, is like, what is, like, we're not talking enough about the brain rot of the left, like how no one is really immune to conspiratorial thinking. And how much this is also kind of to Latour's piece of like, or what I got out of it is like, we can't just use the tools, think that like in the ivory tower on the left, that like the tools we use are only belong to us and get upset when people on the right or people that were not in political agreement with use those same methods to then undermine what we believe is true, or to criticize what we've inherently believed is true on the pure side of the aisle. So yeah, I'm thinking about that, and I'll shut up. But I'm like kind of working on a project where I'm kind of examining the neoliberal, like white, gay, anti-trans, conspiratorial puppeting or parroting of really vile language. And thinking about like who gets excluded, like what exclusion does to someone's personal politics that then like the conspiratorial right kind of has a wide open space for them to fall into.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. I mean, there's a lot to return to here. I want to talk about archetypes. I really, it's so interesting that we begin this workshop on the day Lindsey Graham dies. Um, and I'm wondering if there are already probably there's stuff happening on the image boards and Reddit maybe about, how he was murdered by like a rent boy or something. Who knows? I'm sure there'll be all sorts of things. But this thing of I like to think of it as the speaking position of the wounded subject, and we can go back to this idea of trauma. But I think that we have shifted away somehow from the notion of trauma as a shame and an experience to be healed or an experience to be lived through. And we have come now to the understanding of trauma as component of identity, like as like part and parcel of like not only the collective consciousness, but like one's personal identity. Like I have trauma, I am a traumatized subject. And in that sense, I think almost that conspiracy theory is a great way of looking at the idea that like the traumatized subject, the wounded subject, is a subject who is also experiencing pleasure in that, right? They're experiencing the pleasure of being the subject who can speak from the position of purity by virtue of the wound. It absolves them, and I see this in a lot of leftist circles of the responsibility of speaking that it at the same time demands of those that it speaks to. Um, and I think that's one of the big symptoms of the left right now. I think that when we look at traditional right wing, whatever conspiracy theory, the wounded subject is there too, but how the wounded subject is articulated comes through differently. And I'm wondering now if we're seeing weird convergences and a messiness. But yeah, I love talking about that stuff. Yeah, for sure. Um, Peggy and then Luis.
So I was going to say you had asked us to find something that was sort of conspiracy on the internet, and I was going to talk about Michelle Obama being a man. But this morning I woke up and I read about Lindsey Graham, and I was like, if I were a novelist like Dan Silver does all these conspiracies all the time, uh, I would go and start with O'Connell, who has just disappeared and we don't know where he is right now, but also had a coronary, and then go to Graham and think that somebody's going around and assassinating these people in some ways. I mean, I'm like, and I'm totally enjoying this. I mean, I'm just like, what does that mean about me? I mean, I mean, I'm just, I'm just ready to enjoy myself with these things. There's nothing else I can do. I'm pretty powerless. So that's, and I'll stop talking.
No, I think thank you. I think what it says about you is that you're a person living through this time, and you're taking pleasure in what Baudrillard called the kind of hallucination of the mass object, which we all are, and the simulation, which the reason Baudrillard hated the Matrix was because he said they got his work wrong. There's no getting out of the simulation, right? Like there's no red pill. It's not only do we not get out of it, but like we don't want to because we're making it all the time. And I think these tools are they're tools of pleasure. I see that there are questions and in the chat, which I've neglected a bit. Um, we'll come back to them, but the first one that I saw, the examples of some of the drives that might propel the irrationality of conspiracy theory, from Micah. Uh, I think that the drives are rational drives. I don't know if maybe I didn't say it clearly. I think that the irrational are the specificities, and what I mean by that are everybody's actually a vampire, or they're aliens, or the pyramids were like power stations, or uh, you know, uh, there's a video out there of Hillary Clinton, like killing a child called Frazzle Drip, where she drinks its adrenochrome rich blood in a hotel room. Um, that kind of stuff. But we'll come back to it. Luis.
Yep. It was interesting to hear the conversation, because I guess I mean I guess it's the thing that someone sometimes does, but like to think of like conspiracy theory like outside of the locus of like the American sensibility for me was really interesting. Because I mean I'm originally from Puerto Rico, so I think that that already kind of sets up a really interesting negotiation with whatever we think of like comes from like the American positionality of conspiracy. Like it's interesting then to kind of think because one of the ones that I was thinking a lot about while we were going through while I was going through the text, specifically about the paranoid style in the U.S. Well, I was reading it and kind of they're presenting this idea of like, look, like conspiracy isn't this new thing. It's a mode that's kind of existed and it's kind of unique and like part of the American thing. It was interesting to me to think because through other research and things, I've always been really interested in the circulation of this like very famous, and I would say like maybe one of the most famous conspiracy theories, the protocols of the Elder Zion, uh, which kind of sets up this, I guess, a really interesting conversation to add to maybe some of the things that Jacqueline was talking about. Where, for example, I think that it was an interesting encounter for me being Puerto Rican and having a leftist dad to come to the US and be like, oh, conspiracy theories about, this like Rothschild, Jewish world conspiracy in these circles in the US were thought of as very right wing. But in a lot of like anti imperialist, anti colonial struggle in the Caribbean and Latin America, they were very left wing coded. A lot of us on this kind of like Latin American side of the political conspiracy thing would take the same conspiracy that in the US existed as a right wing conspiracy over on our side of the world. It was definitely a left wing conspiracy. And it was interesting on how it kind of like reacted to these different things, right? Like if we are talking about this like shared trauma and shared wound, I guess it does set up an interesting thing of like how do we consider also that initiation coming from empire and outside of empire, and how that then creates a thing of like, oh, then it's crazy to think that like very hardcore leftists in Puerto Rico has the same kind of trauma response and like reaction to a very, very, very conservative man in like a Republican state. So I guess that also kind of like relativizes things and shakes them up as well. I think I'm particularly interested in thinking about that in like levels of like genre and archetype and thinking of like, okay, so kind of like how Peggy was saying, right? Like, does conspiracy theory also come with its own flavor of like, are you spy thriller? Are you Latin American underdevelopment? Are you global conspiracy? Are you alien? And I think Stewart. I was looking at some of the other writings, and I think she also like talks a lot about. I mean, I'm thinking it'll probably be about this. This whole thing about like the cultural specificity of UFO encounters, and how there's all this idea that like people in the U.S. have encounters with extraterrestrials and the aliens sort of have a certain way of form, and you look at UFO encounters in Mexico and, the aliens are different, but, some of the ships look the same. So I think I'm also, I guess I'm interested in that part of the conversation very much of, how like what flavor of conspiracy you get to exist in, and if that flavor of conspiracy is also influenced by the space, race, politics, culture that you exist in. Like how much of conspiracy theory in the US is like white conspiracy theory, how much of it is, like American conspiracy, and you look at, the rest of the world, and you have different genres that like react differently to that kind of conspiracy.
Hmm. Absolutely. And they are super, I think that they are part and parcel of these various forms of national, racial, ethnic, religious, gender, et cetera, class identities. They're almost like plugins or something, I think, for those already existing conditions. And they emerge specifically through genres that I think are suitable for the people that espouse them. Because what they do, and Micah, this was my main rational drive, let's say, underpinning conspiracy theory is the need for the world to make sense. That's what I would call the number one. But a close second is the need for the self to be assured in its innocence, or the self to be assured in its like lack of complicity in what's happening. So Susan Lepselter actually, I think we'll read some of this. Her longer ethnography, which is called "The Resonance of Unseen Things," is an ethnography of UFO alien abduction survivors, and she's looking at it from a number of different angles. But these are primarily white, middle class, lower middle class, working class people in this kind of support group who speak about the story of their abduction, which often involves physical penetration, right? It involves like an actual, like physical transgression experience that often leaves them with heightened sensitivity, clairvoyance, all these sorts of things. But she speaks about it as a kind of hijacking of which she calls captivity narratives, which are the narratives that were kind of espoused, especially, in the 19th into the early 20th century, about like white settlers that had been abducted by natives in the United States and had lived for a time with them, and then somehow were released or brought back to to civilization, and were like, wow, I hate it here. No, and like went back to, the savages who had actually turned them into a noble subject, right? So I'm excited for us to get into that. Um, and you know, I've been thinking about Puerto Rico a lot, actually, Luis, because obviously everything that's going on with infrastructure there and the power grid, but like we've actually gotten to a place where like we can say, and it's all public record, that like this Hollywood story, in this case, the story of like an actual, hedge fund literally buying the debt of Puerto Rico, um, happened. And like the experience of being someone who's there as this American company buys the debt of the place, right? There are a couple of them, but the big one's called Golden Tree. It's we've gotten to a place where we have to kind of like reconcile with these things. And I believe, to speak more broadly, that like so many other things which get exported with cultural imperialism, like forms of identity, for instance, all kinds of identity. But I think this particular form of conspiracy theory gets exported violently to other places. And it's not that there wasn't conspiratorial thinking already, but the specific form takes hold. You see it now throughout Europe, but you see it throughout the global South as well, now. And it's culture industry, right? Because I think about conspiracy theory in this country as like a Hollywood thing, right? I don't think we can have this wildly mythologizing archetypal set of images and horror and science fiction without Hollywood, one of the major cultural violent exports, right? So, um, yeah, the way that that then gets apprehended in different places takes on these specific like variants, right? But like Adorno, I mean, the guy was a real conspiracy theorist, wasn't he? I mean, he was talk about a paranoid thinker, you know? I mean, his whole thing was, hey, fascism, I just fled it and it was like literal and terrible and bad things happened, actual, but they can happen here too here in the US, where your culture industry is based around these things that I recognize as fascistic, right? He called them stereotypes. He had a whole diagnosis, an incredible diagnosis of the culture industry. But I mean, it's very much like, you know, it's what we would maybe call the basic form of a conspiracy theory articulated through this other form of discourse that we now see as this elevated Frankfurt School, you know, the guy that created critical theory, some say. But I see him as like, I mean, I love the guy, but I see him as deeply paranoid about what was going on around him. Um, can I just ask, are we supposed to take a break or something? I'm sorry, like, I don't know.
If you want, we could take a break at
Is that
some point. Yeah, I mean, and we could do like a 10-15 minute break, whatever sounds good to you.
is that something people want? Maybe like 10 minutes or something? Okay, let's do that. And then and I don't know, will the hands stay so that we'll remember who t wants to talk? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't really close the Zoom. It's just we stop the recording for a minute, so it's perfect.
Got it. Thank you. I'm bad at computer. Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's come back at what is it? 317, 327? Cool. Thanks everybody. Okay. Um, shall we get back into our discussion? Lillian, please.
Thank you. I guess I should probably start this just by saying I am coming to this workshop as very much like an outsider to the discipline of anthropology. So I'm learning a lot and that's delightful. But I think the thing that I've been thinking about and really struck by across the reading and then this conversation is the it's like the seduction of knowing, like the wanting to know, the wanting to meaning make. And if the drive of maybe not all not to universalize, but like the drive of much of like conspiracy thinking, paranoia thinking, and all of these like connected subcultures and like small groups and communities is the desire to like to meaning make and to narrativize. I think there's just this really kind of delightful paradox in the the study of that is also a kind of desire to meaning make and to understand and to narrativize. And I don't know, I think in general always kind of tickled by like human like hypocrisy and all these little like just whatever tension that is of like wanting to know, needing to know. um I'm fascinated by this space, and then in particular the study of it, the desire to think about that specific approach as a methodology is just a kind of like beautiful fractal of thinking that's really all. That's my comment, is that I think it's all really delightful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. And I hope that maybe even with some of the rest of our time today, we can hear about what people are thinking about maybe their projects or the if they brought a little media object or something around conspiracy, they could share it with us because I'm really interested in the different approaches and the different ways and that the different paths that brought us here. Um, because I also think this is an important question in the anthropology of conspiracy theory, right? Like conspiracy theory as such is not like a block, you know. I've noticed that there are different sort of, shall we say, tiers of belief when it comes to conspiracy theory, you know, like I've spent way too much time and I don't know what this says about me, but long before I was studying it and therefore, disconnected on 4chan, 8chan, image boards. I was a kid uh, of the 90s that was into all of that, rotten.com and just trying to find, for whatever reason, the worst possible things I could find to see. And what I noticed in those worlds and what I continue to notice is that you have a real range of participation, shall we say, in conspiracy theory, like ranging from people that are kind of like ironic tourists to those that are so possessed by what they believe that it like destroys them. It destroys their lives. It completely alienates them from those around them. Um, I can't tell you how many like boomer generation Americans I've personally known who are totally alone because of their beliefs, but not just because of their beliefs, because of their style of expressing them, their insistent style of expressing them, which has left them more or less abandoned. So there is that question, and um, I'm interested in the old epistemology stuff where it's like how do we know what we know is true? And I think conspiracy theory is a fascinating case study there, because it uses a lot of the elements of like well-established fact, right? To um, repurpose, shall we say, or like reconceptualize like the baseline, of truth. And you hear so many people say, wow, it used to be that you could have different political beliefs and have a civilized conversation with someone. I'm not sure if that's true, maybe so. But it seems to me that like that table, that metaphorical, like let's all come to the table or whatever, is like kind of gone or something? I mean, it seems like that sort of epistemological baseline of can we at least agree that that person's a human being and not a reptile? Like we don't we, we don't share some of these like really what we maybe mistakenly presupposed as like givens anymore in a very real way. And that's fascinating when you don't have that like shared baseline of like, it's not just how you feel and what you believe, but like what you believe is like literally the truth about reality, the physical space, the idea of the world being round, et cetera, right? Daniel, hi.
Hi, yeah. Um, I just want to chime in on what Jacqueline and Louise was saying earlier about sort of like how the elements of conspiracy theory act like sort of like world building pieces that kind of slot in to across different crowds. And I'm coming from this as like an Indonesian. I'm currently in Jakarta and we are going through like some really rough political times. I guess everybody is, but uh I think the interesting thing is like how these conspiracy theories, especially from my local context, is very, very um it uses the same methods, the same narratives that there's always someone behind the scenes pulling the strings. But I guess it's very similar to what Louise is saying. A lot of the times it's for us because of the history of our country. It's usually it's always the CIA behind it, or it's the IMF, or it's the EU, and it's where our history with Western imperialism is sort of really informs the way that we uh, look and I don't know aestheticize these things to the point where I think um, while a lot of like media figures wouldn't also don't want to uh, um, code themselves as leftists, a lot of them do borrow talking points from uh like leftist circles as well. Like for example, like a couple years ago we had sort of like a popular student protest that lasted for a couple of weeks, and this and to a lot of like pundits and like media figures, it was the CIA. Like they said like, oh yeah, they did it in Ukraine, they did it in Georgia, they did it in Taiwan, and now they're gonna do it here, and it just very conveniently slots into whatever they were trying to say. And I think remembering about what happened back then, I also I think the part from the Hofstadter reading really jumped out at me about the value of like the renegade, about how like the X whatever is sort of like, heralded or lionized as the person with all the inside information, because a lot of the people who were parroting these talking points um were also Western pundits, or some of them are like scholars in Europe, in America. One of them, I believe, was like an ex-Marine, and they were sort of lionized as these sort of they know because they've had these experiences, and I guess yeah. I think the one thing that I do also want to add is I think it's interesting seeing going forward, because I think some of the other readings are going to talk about like digital subcultures and like digital spaces, but so far the readings, I think 3 out of 4 of them are like pre-internet, so I'm really curious about seeing the role that online spaces play in this. Not just because of like the obvious thing, which is like the speed at which all these informations come. Like I think when Hofstadter was talking about, he was talking about it like they were sending out newsletters, which take, weeks to publish and write and send. But, at this moment we get it instant. But also, I think the other aspect that I'm really hoping to explore is the the participatory aspect of it, where I think you mentioned like message boards earlier, and I'm coming across this as someone who was like a teenager playing video games in 2014 when like Gamergate happened, and there was sort of like this the element of like you can also participate in the rituals of um yes, like doxing and harassing people online, but also participate in, I guess, traumatizing yourself and the other members of this community repeatedly. And yeah, I'm just really interested in that sort of aspect of what kind of rituals they build in these spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. There's a lot there. I mean, this first for your first point, which I think is extremely important, is this thing that we have to keep in mind, and I'm so glad that we have people from different places who can speak to this. And I hope no one is afraid to, write in the first person. And I guess maybe I thought it goes without saying, but certainly I'm interested in your experiences as ethnographers, but also as people who are like giving us your experience of an experience, which is what I think one of the real values of ethnographic writing is, right? We're not just getting like the facts about this group in this place, but we're getting someone's take, and we can actually understand it, on 2 levels. But certainly, obviously in a place like Indonesia, um, where you have this public record at this point, right? Like the Indonesian the mass killings of 65, 66, right? Which we now, of course, know were supported by the US and UK governments in their ongoing, anti-communist quest. And so when a nation has that collective memory, that collective trauma of interference from unseen powers, it's, I've always found really insulting, right, to like refer to them as conspiracy theorists or as delusional or as paranoid, when like paranoia, when proven right, like has to then be rethought. Um, and so, of course, there's a completely different posture towards conspiracy theory as a style, um, and that's what I think is really one of our, I hope, one of our kind of recurring important points is that as a style, it is devoid of ideology as such, right? Like it can be used for anything, and it can be used to convince others of anything from these speaking positions, often the speaking position of the outsider expert, right? Who like has something to teach those that don't know. And so when you actually have a documented history of like the undermining of baseline authenticity, so to speak, in a place like Indonesia, of course, like, and it happens here now as well, it happens here as well, where you can point that always present doubt towards something like a genocide or a mass student protest movement, right? You can very easily say this is the CIA or whatever because it probably is. I mean, right? Like, but we don't know. I mean, and because of that impossibility of getting to this baseline where nowadays, like even something like investigative journalism, which says, okay, once and for all, like here's the proof, no one believes it when sort of the basic presupposition, let's say, of like a right-wing conspiracist traditional politics is anything that comes out of the mouth of one of those lefty people is damaged information already. There's always already like no trust, no baseline of trust. It makes it impossible to like transmit forms of information in a way that sticks. And that's why I think it's so effective. Um, I read this really annoying article years ago by like, it was like a BuzzFeed article or something. It was when QAnon came onto the scene in whatever 2017, and it was like it called it like a mass psychosis. It called it like a mass delusion. And I thought, how crazy, excuse the irony, but how amazing that like the immediate response to this belief pattern is to like pathologize countless hundreds of thousands of people as like not just like irrational, but like literally schizophrenic, right? It's like actually taking the language of the psychoanalytic diagnosis, which is so common to the history of so many of our identities in this country. They start as pathologies. Um, and saying, these people are literally disconnected by virtue of their affliction, their kind of their psychic affliction from the reality that the rest of us are experiencing. Um, it's a lazy critique at least, but at worst, it's like an extremely violent and totally ineffective thing. So yeah, I think we have to speak more about this idea that like conspiracy theory is not like it never emerges from a vacuum. And like when we look at these now declassified documents about like, for instance, what the vision of intelligence operations and statecraft were for the CIA when they were finally officially formed as the CIA in whatever 1947, I think they had previously been the OSS um, under Truman, maybe, I think, was literally to like mess with the rest of the world so that the fears that we had at the time could be relieved through subterfuge, period. And they then proceeded to do that and still are, right? So, um, when you have it in writing, and then you also have these people who can then control the way in which this information gets transmitted. I always remember after 9/11, the CIA reclassified documents that had been declassified in the National Archive that had anything at all to do with them having been wrong in the past about Russia, about China, and so forth. It was literally this national affect of like shame around, the politics of shock. How could it possibly have been that this thing was brought off in New York City on 9/11 without these people knowing about it and so forth, right? Um, so there's this level at which like this baseline confusion is not random. It's by design. And that's something that sounds like a conspiracy theorist, but it's not wrong, right? And it's remarkable to me these things being in the public record, how many people, and even conspiracy theorists who are ostensibly interested in this kind of information, don't know about it or don't really know about it when they talk about things like MK Ultra, which was a real thing. But they talk about it as just, mind control experiment, LSD. But God, that's the tip of the iceberg when you can read it. So it's wild because we have access to all of this information in this archive, but like, I don't know, for whatever reason, nobody really cared. Like, no one really wants to read it or something like that. Um, anyway, yeah, Alex.
Um, yeah, there's like so much great stuff that's been said. Really love this idea of like conspiratorial epistemology, which is like a shared pool of knowledge almost, and it has like an ironic intersectional kind of quality about it, that you can like crosshatch references and join things up, and then like it ends up being, this amazing kind of, oh, it was lizard people all along. It's kind of, it goes back to this. It can all be, I think of someone like David Icke, who is just like amazing at making all these links back to this sort of fundamental core principle that he has. But the other thing that I really, I suppose, and also to that point, this idea that's been mentioned a few times, the need to have the world placed into a narrative. But I think you could actually go a step further than that and say it's a need to re-enchant the world, to make it to bigger than a narrative that we have, bigger than a material narrative that we have. But actually, my point, after all the things about trauma, it seems kind of deeply inappropriate to even mention it. But it's something Peggy said about the entertainment factor, and it's even in the Stewart piece, right, where she says actually conspiracy theories are fun. They are fun, and I think back to like when I first got into conspiracy theories. I was like 13, and I was sitting on a sofa watching Loose Change, the 9/11 documentary with my sister. Now, there was no rhyme or reason that I should have been doing that. I had no need to re-enchant 9/11 or to place it into a narrative that I needed to understand, but like it was fun, and it was like to a certain extent an element of that persists even now. So yeah, and then just sorry, another point about like you can have kind of what seems like an apolitical conspiracy theory. So I always think a good example of that is like Mandela effect. Oh, what Mandela effect do you kind of, it feels kind of apolitical. And then recently I noticed this really funny thing with like, they were switching off CERN, the Large Hadron Collider. And people are like, they're turning it on in 2030. And you had like sections of the manosphere and like the grind set mentality types who are like, right, the elites have given you the time frame. You've got till 2030 to buy your Lamborghini and get out of the matrix. And like, so it's really interesting to watch like the ideology come like seep in. Yeah, not sure if there's a question in that, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all good points, and 9/11 was really that was my entrance into being interested in conspiracy theory. My dad, well, here's full disclosure, my dad was in the Secret Service, and as a 9/11 survivor, he was in Seven World Trade, the third building that fell. I was 20 years old, that no one could explain. And it started all this stuff, right? Jet fuel can't melt steel beams, blah, blah. So I was interested not only in his story about what had happened, which was never conspiratorial in nature per se, being a, obedient federal agent and an intelligent man, but the stories that were generating around him about from people maybe in our family or friends about what was actually happening, which is something that was never able to be explained like as such. And I don't mean that it wasn't able to be explained like logistically. Like obviously then there was this whole thing about engineers having fights about it and stuff like that, and history and what was going on with the Saudis and and go back to Kissinger. But there was no um the incomprehensibility of it and the national affect afterwards, in which the security industry, the federal US federal security industry model gets privatized rapidly and sold off to all of the developed nations of the world where it now rests. Um, uh, these things could not be explained in a way that I believe was satisfactory to anyone. Um, and I think continues to be unsatisfactory. And so what ended up happening was the this thing which is called paranoia, which we kind of project into the fringes of places like conspiracism, is, again, to go back to someone like Foucault or Baudrillard, power is paranoid. Like it has to be, right? And it bases its, for instance, thinking about the intelligence arm of things, which I've been doing a lot lately because I'm trying to write something about it. It bases itself on the idea that like all possibilities are on the table, all possible futures are on the table, and that nothing is a coincidence. And that once those things can be understood, they can be wrangled, they can be harnessed, right, as intelligence agencies have done to create outcomes, to influence outcomes in a world where everything is understood to be a kind of swirling, chaotic mess. So it's so interesting to me to see the way in which paranoia gets projected outward at the fringe, where one could argue, especially when you talk about the history of specifically US, statecraft, it's a paranoid practice, right? It kind of has to be in order to survive. If there's no fear, even those that are created wholesale, and this is how the private security industry now, you know, makes its money, it creates, in a lot of cases, the fears and advises its clients what to be scared of in order to, let us protect you from it. So, yeah, I think about this a lot, the kind of like double scale discourse around paranoia, like who gets to be paranoid but not get diagnosed as schizophrenic, you know. Tomas, hi.
Hi, Joseph. Yeah, very fascinating topics. I was very curious about this shift in the conspiratorial theories, not being like a destructive or regressive point of view, but a constructive. And I'm going back to what Alex was mentioning about this making fun and in some regards about what Kathleen Stewart in the article says about these bubbles or worlds within these conspiratorial ideals and yeah about these cultural phenomena, for example music that is very common, games as well, but for example how these conspiracies fuels and like nurtures um, ways of yeah creative not only creative thinking but also endeavors and different yeah expressions in the same artistic, for example I don't know, Birds of Canada, for example. There are many conspiracies behind this group. Also Boreal, there is a different conspiracies around these cult figures. So it's becoming like the idea of this phenomena, like it needs these cult figures or conspiracies behind these artistic expressions so that it can evolve and transform yeah to get sense maybe about these worlds.
Yeah, I think it's the point is very well taken. I mean, one of the ways that I look at conspiracy theory, and I think could be helpful to those of us in here who are looking at the arts or who are looking at these different kind of cultural artifacts, is as what anthropologists would call an expressive culture, right? it is actually like a way of assigning a certain aesthetics to everyday life. It gives us a kind of baseline way of like dealing with any kind of stimuli that we see, with the understanding that like there is a hidden world underneath the world we are given, and that unseen world is something I can excavate. You know, that's sexy. It's fun. You know, it creates an expert in someone, but it also creates a really, I think, passionate connection to the world, which constantly has to be. Think of the labor here, right? Like if you're thinking this way, you constantly have to doubt what's in front of you. You have to see what the explanation is underneath. You have to work towards articulating that. I mean, it's kind of what anthropologists do, you know. Culture is not just a given; it's like a thing to be understood in its various guises. Um, I'm really interested in what the conspiracy theories around Boards of Canada are now, but I guess we don't have to talk about it. I'm a big fan, and I was just listening to their new record. It's really good. Um, but maybe we could talk about that later. Yeah, so this thing with ritual, right? I've heard some of you use the word, and um, I think the study of ritual, which is obviously so vital to the history of anthropology, can more or less be understood like this. And I hope that thinking about expressive cultures, thinking about ritual, when we do get into, and I hope we do get into digital subcultures and so forth, um, the ritual is, I guess, maybe sort of the Anthro 101 way of thinking about it is like traditionally a ritual is like a spatiotemporal event, right? Which in which the kind of intangible values of a culture become tangible through participation and performance. And so in online world, we have to then understand that like a few things become deeply obscured in the oversaturated, rapid fire production of images and sounds and cultural artifacts, right? Which happen at a bewildering rate. But we have to then understand that like the classical idea of like the spatiotemporal event, it has its own kind of logic in the digital space. That I think human beings are both generating and struggling all the time to like almost keep up with. Um, and so it becomes much more difficult, I think, to say what intangible values are being made tangible in the whatever meme or the like, mukbang video on YouTube, Well, the easy answer would be, I guess, overconsumption, whatever. But like, really? Like, what for me, it's like, what is actually happening here, which gets 20 million views, right? Like, which causes this public to gather around it ritualistically as it's being brought off. Um, and I hope that our explorations of these things will help us try to figure that out because I mean, I don't know personally, but I think there's probably just a lot of answers, maybe, or possible answers. Um, I think that something Alex said before, it's not just a matter, right, of making sense of the world, but re-enchanting it. And certainly this occurs after 9/11, but I'm thinking about the QAnon folks that I hung out with for years who were essentially like restaging the book of Revelation. It was this kind of quasi secular, like millenarian, right? By millenarian, I mean apocalyptic. It was looking forward to the end. Um, Conspiracy theory, and it was so seductive because it kind of like it had a place for like all of the other conspiracy theories, right? Yeah, as Luis said, starting with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, what, that's like 1902 or something, and it's one of the first really popular Western conspiracy theories about Jewish people. But it like actually in itself was a reboot going back to like 12th, 15th century, like the blood libel, the idea that like Jews were baking the blood of the Gentile baby into their bread for power and so forth. And, it's more or less nowadays speculated that it was written by some Russian Tsarist, right? To mess with the idea of communism or something. But it's still very real, and it gets brought back as one of the core elements of QAnon, and it gets attached to the events of that last book, right, of the New Testament, where Christ returns, he goes through the period of tribulation, he defeats the beast, and he takes the remnant of Israel or whatever it is to New Earth. But here it's Trump, right? Like he's the prophet crusader, and so it was interesting for people to call it a cult and stuff in the media because it's like, wow, but I mean, what other cult in the traditional sense of the word have we ever seen where like the leader is a sitting president? I mean, it's a very different thing, actually, I think. It was more of like a thought virus, or I don't know, we could get into it, but it was this idea that like we will see the biblical story enacted on Earth. And it was almost banal. It was like his version of defeating the beast and ascending and everything was like, he's going to have the FBI arrest Hillary Clinton and stuff. And then, like, whatever. And then we'll all be happy, you know? But I mean, I meet people in the field who have like architectural specifications for what New Earth will look like above Jerusalem, how many people will be. It's always 144,000, but who they will be and so forth. So it was this kind of myth making, connecting it to the banal, connecting it to like the shittiness of the real. But it also was, you can be a hero, like they called it, being a patriot. But it was like you can. This is the difference, maybe, or one of the important differences between the, just to oversimplify, the left and right version of how do we deal with power. Foucault's basically like, listen, I mean, you get to a certain point and you don't even know who to point the finger at anymore. That's its the beauty of its styling. It's a gray zone. There's no, but this QAnon thing vis-a-vis the right a few years ago was, no, listen, power has a name and an address, and it's this pizza place, or it's January 6th, or excuse me, when was that? When they stormed the Capitol. Let's show up, and we can actually get them and kill them. And if we do that, if we hang Mike Pence or whatever, the hero's journey will be completed. This is why I say Hollywood. I mean, even the QAnon thing, their slogan, where we go one, we go all, you ever wonder about this? This comes from this movie that I loved as a kid called White Squall, starring Jeff Bridges. Truly, this is where it's taken from. It's about these guys on a ship and they're in a bad storm and they say, where we go one, we go all. And it's like, we're the crew of the ship and we're going to be on the boat until it sinks or something. It's all sort of the detritus of like the blown out Hollywood culture industry, it's and I thought that was new for a conspiracy theory. It took everything. It took all of the other ones that existed and found a place for them, in the service of this hero's journey story. And every time the thing didn't happen, and the Vice documentary came out. Oh, look, it's the Watkins. The left was going, oh, we got them now. We now know that Q wasn't this disgraced Fed. He's these assholes that started the image boards, of course, and they thought, well, now it'll all dissolve, but then it didn't. It didn't. Like nobody cared in the QAnon world that these people believed it was these Watkins guys, you know. It can always retroactively kind of like reconfigure the past and say and come up with all of these reasons why the one thing didn't happen when they said, and it can always be what's this word that I love that I always forget, like, pushed back, and so forth. There's never an end to the story. There's never actually like a conclusion to thinking in a conspiracist fashion, right? Yeah, Luis.
Yeah, kind of like hearing about this is is interesting because I guess like my framing then really quickly comes to like maybe there's an interest then in like a semiotic kind of like investigation into then like imagining like, oh, okay, like if I'm following what you're saying, there is then like a really interesting point to make of the conspiracy as mythic, and that these kind of like animating myths are taken from, and I guess that would be also like the very strange thing of like, would then like the Hollywood canon of movies and TV be the mythopoetic register that we have from America? And then that there is then this kind of like game of saying, well, it's not necessarily like a game of saying conspiracy theory then has the same narrative structure as, movie or TV, but that whatever happens in movie and TV are kind of like the plot points that become the myth that stays open, right? Because that's something that I was thinking about, that with that last point that you were saying, right? That like whatever happens also in the conspiracy theory isn't really like motivated by this like very strict fact, like fiction narrative, point A, B, C conclusion. It's much more about this thing of like, can this keep on generating affect, action, discourse, pleasure, these things that we were talking about. And I guess there is a pretty like, I mean, I would also think it's like a very like weird, like sad kind of like pronostic of like saying like, oh well, yeah, conspiracy theory then is just what we're gonna call the myth of the 21st century if we're looking back at this time period 500 years in the future, right? The same way we imagine the mythic register when we look back, in the ancient times, maybe that's just going to be our myth, like the humans of, the 21st century thought that there were reptiles and aliens, and this was the animating fantasy.
Yeah. And to make it even more maybe tragic and interesting is that like, if the mythopoetic register, let's say, is Hollywood, that also in its turn was this kind of, and continues to be, this sort of repository for the affects of its era as well, right? Like it already was this kind of myth making practice that got turned through these particular technologies into this huge industry that rules the world. And so I think of it as almost parasitically kind of attached to the energies of that history, um, and using it for a self-perpetuating, a group perpetuating, absolutely practice, right? This is why I think I read a lot about cults and new religious movements, as you might imagine. And when the QAnon thing kept being called a cult, I thought, how interesting, right? I mean, first of all, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in this cult, millions at this point, right? And yet, the cult, traditionally speaking, is a physically organized group who are practicing what they often see as an alternative form of social organization based around a very particular hierarchy. And again and again, especially in the history of cults in the United States, when shit goes wrong, they're out. Like there's an end to the story. It's like, oh, really? Like we can't all be in this house in Waco, like, oh, we can't, whatever, like, so we'll just all poison ourselves, like the end, like the end of our story is going to happen somewhere else on a comet or in heaven or something, right? But this is not about like coming to a kind of material like resolution. It's like a self perpetuating force, and it constantly mutates. I mean, it mutates. Peggy was talking about. You mentioned Peggy in the beginning about the Michelle Obama thing. Well, this that they call it transvestigation, you know, which is its whole industry of people that take it upon themselves to investigate these figures and expose them as being trans and take on the discourse of a forensic expert. But of course, what they're doing is just like sort of wallowing in like the totally bewildering oversaturated world of images and sounds and so forth, right? And think, oh, look, if you see here, I'll pause the video and you see something about the face or the hands and so forth. Well, we can say, first of all, how cruel, how irrational, but to me, it's a very, very rational underpinning when of course so many people, especially in this country now, have become so deeply fixated on transness. It's something that is now, I suppose you could say, being seen as a sign of the undoing of the social fabric itself. And what's convenient about somebody like a transvestigator is they're almost acting as a kind of oracle or guide into this thing where they go, actually, it's worse than you think. It's not just people come out and they do this and there's transitioning, but those in power are always already trans, and they have been. And this conspiracy against gender as such is well underway. Um, and people feel and participate in this, I think, often without even really having to articulate what the underlying rational drive is, right? Which for them is like this idea that the social fabric ought to be maintained or something like that, right? Yes, Andrea?
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you were saying like before about our relationship with myth and maybe if myth had to do with Hollywood and so on. And I was wondering if maybe had to do with an absence of trust on institutions and at the same time kind of like a way of a search for meaning now that we don't have religion as the first thing that dictate us what to think about. And so that brings me to what Alex was saying about conspiracy being fun. And I was wondering maybe is it fun or is it childish? And not childish in a way of like being dumb or not relevant, but childish in a way of being immature in the sense that we're like looking for a truth or looking for something to be um, told to us as factual.
Yeah, I mean, childish in the sense of being innocent, right? Like being able to like re-virginize. Remember, there was this re-virginizing movement in the US a while ago that was really fun, where people said, I'm a virgin again, I got my whatever put back on. But it's this thing of like, I'm I can restage myself as a person who truly is innocent. And in that quest for experience, um, can have this relationship to the world in which, like, I'm constantly having to deal with all of this horrific stuff that's being thrown at me that is a mixture of, I think, yeah, a distrust in institutions, but also what we could kind of interpret as the new religion as such, right? Like faith-based carrying on, like faith-based discourse. Faith is I think it's more than fun. It's an intensity. Like it literally like fuels people to live and stuff like that. Faith in all sorts of things, right? Um, so it's kind of like a restaging of the religious style, you know? I mean, and I'm talking about not just conspiracy theorists, but I mean, I meet people who are like really passionate atheists and stuff like that, right? And what's so annoying about them to me is that like they practice atheism religiously. They practice it as a kind of proselytization. They use these ancient forms of engaging with and speaking about the sacred in their quest to show us that there's no God or whatever their problem is, right? Um, so yeah, I do think not only conspiracism, right, but like a lot of our contemporary discourses are like childish as such, for sure. Um, Trinidad, sorry.
No, thank you. I know we're running out of time, and a lot of us probably have a hard stop. I have a question, but also kind of a comment, wondering if we're going to deal with this later down the line. I mean, I'm Argentinian, and I'm really happy to point fingers at the US for all conspiracy. But I'm kind of concerned that I'm not fully understanding the universe of conspiracy theories. I mean, can we ground this in space and time a little bit? Because we're reading in English and we're talking in English, and obviously a lot of the examples that are being circulated are relatable through that medium. But is this, I'm anxious as an anthropologist talking about universals, and you might as well, and everyone in the room as an anthropologist might do as well. Is this something that we can talk about as something you can see in all cultures, that belongs to all types of epistemologies, all languages? Is this something that comes through, like, I don't know, Anthropocene type of framework? Do you see it historically as emerging at a very specific point, like other fabulations, like monster theories? Are we going to look at that? I mean, it's more of an interest in that topic if there's room for adapting some of the content of the course around more of a non-American based way of thinking about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I think I'm certainly open to, I mean, grounding it in space and time. I'm not exactly sure what the ask is, but I think what one of our paradoxes here is going to be is that um, it is very much a Western centric
Mm.
discourse that has infected the rest of the world in a very particular style, is what I'm trying to express. Whether or not conspiratorial thinking happens everywhere, I imagine the answer would probably be yes. But I do think that conspiracy theory as such takes on these specific forms that are not necessarily born in the places where they're now being espoused. So I think we have to think about the relationship between like discourse and cultural imperialism in like this very real way, even though we can say, okay, I'm going to look at conspiracy theory as it emerges in another place, in another country where I'm from or whatever, and the specificities around that. I think what's remarkable about it is how it travels and how it can um, insinuate itself. And yes, I do think that it's a very modern. This incarnation of it is a very modern uh, phenomenon, right? Like if we were going to talk about the history of conspiracist thinking, we certainly, first of all, couldn't do it in 4 sessions,
Mm.
but it would be it should happen. I mean, I'd love to teach that class. I'd have to read some things again. But I think, for instance, one of the big things you hear from American conspiracy theorists whenever Argentina is mentioned, can you guess? It's the Nazis, right? So like even though Argentina is not America, it's not the US or whatever, the story always has to be about like this very particularly like post-war American paranoia that just gets kind of like plunked into places, you know. I think it very much is like it can be like a deeply myopic, you know, practice. Um, but what I welcome in here, and I hope I articulated was that I'm interested in troubling that, and I do want. I do value and want these kind of different perspectives on how these things happen in other places. You know, I mean, I'm not an authority on whether or not they do or how they do, right? So I wouldn't presume to say, yes, of course, you know, but I imagine there are ways to interpret this sort of discursive paradigm, if that's what we want to call it, in all spaces in different ways, you know. Um, I think a lot of the ancient myths that I've had experience reading in school and stuff, ranging from all really all over the world, and when these kind of I took a class on ancient peoples and myth, it was to my mind, there was always an element of conspiracist thinking in the way that the stories unfolded in various ways, right? And it was often like a lesson, or there was like something in it which um, gave birth to the cosmos or something, but it was like a distrust one of these archetypes had with somebody else, with another figure. So I would argue, yeah, I mean, it has to go back, right? It has to go back to a much more perhaps even prehistorical impulse. But as we get through history and we get to where we are now and we get into the muddiness of, yeah, this, Luis called it a semiotics. I mean, it's a deeply messy one too, because the semiotic set could get and does, I think, get violently exported elsewhere, but it doesn't mean that those symbols then carry exactly this, right, the same weight or the same meaning or right, or have the same history. Of course they don't. So yeah, I think it's an extremely important topic you bring up. Um, and I hope that we can get to it in the time that we have, you know. Although my feeling is it would be a longer thing, but it's something I've always wanted to jump into with people from around the world.
Right, thanks.
So Luis, we go until 4:30. So I was hoping Luis and I will speak at some point before our next meeting about this idea of groups. Um, I notice really in the end, what, like half of the people registered showed up. We've got 30, but there's like 60 on the thing. So we'll see what happens next time, I guess. I know of a few people who contacted me and said they couldn't make the first session, but they'll be here next time. I think we should talk about the possibility of smaller clusters, even if we just meet for 20 minutes in these clusters in, you know, outside of class or something like that, since obviously we won't be able to do it in here. Because I think it's important that like everybody's project gets looked at by people who are maybe on a similar page in terms of how they're looking at this this course, this seminar, this what do you call it, workshop. And then I think it could be productive because we could come back to the rest of our sessions with conclusions or ideas about how this particular cluster of people are looking at conspiracy theory, how there are differences within the group, etc. Does that make sense? Does that seem like it would be valuable? Because my worry in a course of this short length and huge size is that we won't be able to pay proper attention to everyone's contributions, and I don't want that. Um, but yeah, I mean, for next time, I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope it's sparked some thinking. And for next time, I'd really like for us to try to think about gesturing towards this is my going to be my project, or this is sort of the way in which I'm going to be approaching this. And there's nothing too specific. I mean, listen, we're in a 4 session workshop. Like, get specific. Don't give yourself some kind of like incredible task. I mean, when I teach this to undergraduates, or when I used to teach it to undergraduates semester long, I would ask them to go and find a conspiracy theorist in the world or online and try to talk with them, and had all kinds of incredible results from that. But it's actually not easy. And some people were just in the end like, I couldn't do it. I tried, you know. And so I would have them write about something else that was about the efforts, or the world which was closed to them, that they attempted to like enter, you know. Um, but yeah, I think about things that you're already interested in. I'm sure many of you already are. And let's talk more about the specifics of people's projects next time. I have some presentation material that I'm gonna show next time around visual art. I kind of pivoted, realizing so many of you are in the arts, and I think there's a really rich conversation to be had there about conspiracy theory, conspiracy, and art. And maybe that's one of the ways we can think about this question, Trinidad, as well, right? Like, anyway, thinking about uh, art in its different forms, places, times, and its relationship to the suspicious, or the conspiratorially minded. Um, and yeah, I hope that you've all enjoyed this first session. I've heard so many great ideas and thoughts. Um, so yeah, that's what we'll do next time. And I'm hoping that uh, at the end of next session, or let's say the day or something, or day or two after it, you can submit. What's the best place, Luis? Like the Google Classroom? I'm just asking for everyone to do a 1 page. This is my idea with, let's say, at least 3 citations. They can be from this class, they can be from something else. I'm not picky about it, but is Google Classroom the best place for people to submit that?
I,
Okay,
I,
cool.
I think the Google Classroom also works because if you're interested in this kind of like inter dialogue, if you upload it to the Google Classroom, everybody can see it. So,
Oh,
you could kind of like, you would see everybody's submission. So maybe, you could see titles of submissions and, be like, oh, let me read this, like kind of look at it. So that might also help this kind of like kind of like workshop, dynamic
totally.
that you want.
Okay, great. Do we have any final thoughts, questions?
Is there some parameters for the project? Like you mentioned, 3 citations. I mean, are you looking, if it's a paper, is it 5 pages? Is it 10 pages? If it's a
You
media
you
thing, what sort of guidelines are around that?
you mean for the final, or for the proposal?
Well, it helps to know if we're proposing something, what we might be aiming at the end. Yeah.
Well, the proposal is 1 to 2 pages. The final, you know, I would tend towards a final essay, a final paper, but I'm also thinking that might be a little bit too rigid for this group. So, if your intention is to write a final paper, we can speak about individually, like what my expectations for that would be. But also, if you're trying to do something else, I'm open to that too. Whether we're talking about recordings, visual art, filmmaking, these are things I anticipate and would enjoy seeing, because it gets boring to read a lot of papers. Something I've always felt. Your eyes turn off. Um, but yeah, I don't have like a hard rule about the length of what your final paper will be. Um, but I would love to be able to at least check in like briefly with everybody as we progress, just to see, um, to see where everybody is with it. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. This was really great. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.